So, happy Mother's Day to all of the mothers that are listening. A special day that we recognize mothers and the contributions that they make to our families and the love they show. And today we are going to do something about a couple mothers in the Bible, both from the Old Testament. So we'll get into that here after a word of prayer. Lord, we are thankful that we can be here together today, together with each other, whether in the building or outside of the building. We're still together here to listen to the things from the Bible, things from that you have to say for us. Look at some people that were left as examples or used as examples in the Scripture to edify us into how we should conduct our lives, and we thank you for that. Amen. So this morning, my title is Of Faith and Obedience, and it is going to be about two different women in the Scriptures, both, as I said, in the Old Testament. The first one is a widow, and if you want, you could turn over to 2 Kings chapter 4, and we're going to be in verses 1 through 7 there. While you're turning there, in the Old Testament, as we've examined recently, or over the past year or so, or a couple of years, I've mentioned, there was a problem of a lack of justice in their society. And the rich took advantage of the poor. We know they didn't look after orphans. They didn't take care of widows, who we're going to read about a widow today. And these, among other things, led to the end of their nation or kingdom. Sometimes when I think of a widow, I think of a hunched over old lady with a cane. You know, you think of someone older. I don't want to use terrible words, but craggly looking face, you know, like scary. Oh my goodness, Rose, I'm not talking about you. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about my imagination, Rose, from books that I've read, fairy tales, right? Or kids' movies. And, you know, those are the kinds of things you think about with a widow. Because we like to think that people live a long time. And if you become a widow or a widower, it's not until later in life, right? But in the Bible, in the Old Testament, things were different. I read that the average age of a man is 22 and a half to 25 years old. That's pretty young, right? It said that if you live to be 40 as a man, that was a good, ripe, old age. 40. That was a long time ago for me, right? I don't want to say how long ago it was for some people here, but it was a long time ago for me. So 40, but the average of 22 and a half to 25. Life was really hard, physical, hard. Stress is hard. Not that there's nothing like that today, because there is. It was different kinds. And of course, we have medicine and other things now they also didn't have, right? The cultures in that time could be unforgiving. Growing food and finding food wasn't always easy, especially if you were not in the urban centers or around a town. You know, and many people back then didn't live that way. They lived out, and they raised animals, and they had to grow their own food and take care of themselves, and it was challenging. Law and order was not always reliable. You know, sometimes on the way here, a sheriff went the other way. And thankfully, I was only doing about 45 on Redmond Road, or else I would have got a ticket probably. But that is something that's common. When I go to work every day on the expressway, it would be unusual not to see some type of law enforcement somewhere, right? But back then that wasn't the case. So you were more open to robberies and thieves and other things that could happen. And the man would have been the one that was out there in front of that. People of lower means, as we just read, were taken advantage of or sold into slavery. People of lower means could not always take care of themselves properly. So men were those that were out in the thick of life, and because of that, their life expectancy was a little shorter than a woman's. So how long was a woman's? 35 to 37. So 10 to 12 years longer for the average. And of course, and I didn't look up the upper end, but if we say 40 to 50, then that was good. But 35 to 37. So if I take those two averages, then the chances are there's a lot of widows, right? In society at young ages, what we think of as young ages. So it's different to think about it in that way than what we think about today. Women faced somewhat less dangers than men out in the world. They had their own danger. Childbirth was dangerous in those times. But due to the social structure in the cultures of the day, women were in more of a somewhat protected role, so they weren't out in everything as men were. So that changed. After reading that changed my perception in my mind of a widow. So the widow that we're talking about in 2 Kings, which we're going to read right now, verses 1 to 7, wasn't an 85-year-old woman with two 50-year-old sons, or a 50-year-old and a 55-year-old son. Because if she was, then when I read this, I might read this differently and think, well, the sons were lazy good-for-nothings, right? And how could they be sold into slavery if they were 50 and 55 years old? Couldn't they fend for themselves? No, this was a younger lady, a younger woman, who had a younger husband who died. It doesn't say why, but he's dead. And she goes to Elisha, and it says, now a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord. And the creditor has come to take my two children to be his slaves. Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? And she said, your maidservant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. And he said, go borrow vessels at large for yourself from all your neighbors, even empty vessels, do not get a few. And you shall go in and shut the door behind you and your sons, and pour out into all these vessels, and you shall set aside what is full. So she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They were bringing the vessels to her, and she poured. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not one vessel more. And the oil stopped. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go, sell the oil, pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on the rest. So we don't know how the husband died, only that he was the son of a prophet. So he was somehow Elisha must have known of the son. He probably knows of the prophet somehow, because she says, you know that your servant, being her husband, was a servant of the Lord and feared the Lord. The other thing that we can understand is that they had debt from something. He died probably unexpectedly, and things were left undone in the family financial situation, which a woman in that time would not really have a lot to do with. But people are coming to her and saying, you owe us money. And she didn't have anything to give. So maybe there wasn't a lot of money in the first place. I mean, there's all kinds of situations that could have happened in ancient Israel which would cause something like this to happen, right? Maybe they had money problems in the first place and he sold off some of his family land and it was being held until Jubilee. So we don't know exactly what the situation was, only that they didn't have money and the creditors were coming after her. And she had herself to care for and her 2 sons, besides people coming after her. So her life became really stressful. And she was worried, not just that for herself and her sons, but that her sons now were going to be taken into servants as slaves to pay off the debt. And likely in those days, the people, because we know how Israel was, because we read it from the prophets, she might not have seen her sons again. They could have just been taken and that was it. And the people might not have been, they might have been unscrupulous and kept the sons beyond what was needed, or we don't know how much was needed for it to be worked off. But I think, again, I said, if you take the averages of lifespan, this was not an uncommon thing, which kind of makes sense. Because if the prophets say one of the things that Israel was doing wrong was not taking care of widows, they weren't talking about, a small amount of really old ladies. They were talking about a lot of women who were young and needed assistance. Young, I say young, in my mind, young. But in their time, not necessarily young, but people that needed help. And they needed to take care of these widows because the widows were at their end. They had nothing else. They didn't have, it wasn't like husband and wife who both worked and both had bank accounts and both paid for the house and all these different things in life that we see today. And one of them passes away and the other one can, difficult for sure, but often keep going. Here, if the husband died, there wasn't anything. They didn't have anything. And so they relied on their family or other people to help take care of them. And she was relying on someday her sons growing up and helping her or being there and them working and carrying on the family name. But instead, she was looking at them possibly being taken away into slavery. If they were taken, a note I saw as I was looking at this said that she probably would not see her sons again until the year of Jubilee, because that was the law. In Leviticus 25:39-41, it says, if a countryman of yours becomes so poor with regard to you that he sells himself to you, you shall not subject him to a slave service. He shall be with you as a hired man, as if he were a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. He shall then go out from you, he and his sons with him, and shall go back to his family, that he may return to the property of his forefathers. So if her sons were taken to go as servants, because she says sold as slaves, but according to the law, they would have had to be treated as hired servants because they were paying back something that was owed. She was worried. I don't know when the next Jubilee was. I guess I could probably figure it out if you went and figured out when this was written and could figure things like that out. I'm not like that. So in my mind, I don't know when that was. Maybe Jubilee had another 40 years to go. And she thought, if my sons are gone, well, then I'm going to be gone. And they're probably going to be gone by the time Jubilee's over, right? And so she's looking for something. And so what does she do? She's beyond poor. She has a connection because her husband was the son of a prophet. And so she's thinking. She's a thinker. She decides, I'm not just going to sit here and let anybody take my kids. There's something more I can do. And so she goes, and she doesn't leave the work to her sons, I think, because her sons aren't old enough, personally, at this point. It's either that or, again, her sons are good for nothings, and she doesn't trust them. But she goes to see Elisha, a prophet, who in her mind must have known something about her husband. I don't even know if she already knew Elisha. I can't say. But it's just odd that she just says, Elisha, I'm going to see Elisha. Because there are other prophets. According to this, her husband was the son of a prophet. And she goes to see Elisha. And she must have some amount of faith or hope beyond desperation. Although I think that there is some desperation at this point. But there must be a little bit more than that for her to say, I'm going to go talk to Elisha. She doesn't give up, but she goes and she pleads with the only person she can think of. It says, what did she do to Elisha? She cried out. We hear of people crying out to God, of crying out to other people for assistance and help in the Bible, right? That's exactly what she's doing. She's going to him and she's saying, please, I need help. Crying out, forcefully, saying something. And Elisha has some questions, and then he has instructions. He wants to know, what's in your house? There must be something in your house that's worth something. There's got to be something. And she says, all I have is a jar of oil. A jar of oil, back then, that's nothing. Because everybody had jars of oil. Because in the land they lived in, there are olive trees everywhere. So she had this jar of oil. I couldn't figure out, I looked at olive oil. In the Roman Empire, I know it's a long time after this, but I couldn't get any information from back where she was alive. Olive oil was 12% of the diet. That's a lot. 12%. Lisa's eyes are getting big and she's just thinking of calories, calories, calories. 12%. Olive oil is healthy though, of course. I can't imagine having 12% of my diet be olive oil, but I guess if it was going to be 12% of oils, olive oil would be the one to have, right? But olive oil was common. So he tells her, go out and borrow from all your neighbors as many jugs or vessels, he says. I'm guessing little jugs, big jugs, bowls, whatever you can find, whatever they have for you, go get it. Get your sons in the house with you, close the door, and take your jar or whatever she says jar. I don't know how big jars were back then, but she's got something with olive oil in it, and start pouring it into all these vessels. So you pour it into one, it fills up. You pour it into the next, it fills up. You pour it into the next and keeps filling up. And she just keeps pouring that little jar of olive oil and filling up all of her jars, all of the vessels that she got from her neighbors. And he tells her, once you're done with that, she goes and tells him, I'm done with that. And he says, now go sell it. And once you sell all that oil, then you'll have enough money to pay the creditor, to pay the debt, and you'll have enough left over for you and your sons, so you can raise your sons. And I don't think the sons are working yet. I think they were young, but the point being that eventually she would be able to take care of her family and her sons could grow into working young men, and they would survive and flourish as a family. Because it's not just about that moment. Because for a woman, a mother, a widow, she needed some support some type of family structure, right? And if the family structure wasn't there, that's when people were supposed to help them out. Now, I mentioned that olive trees were everywhere. Olive trees in the Old Testament, in the Bible itself, are very significant in many ways. Today, I've seen pictures online of olive trees that are 2,000 and 3,000 years old. They're massive. They're not tall. They're just wide and spreading and still producing olives after all that time. Olives were important. Olive trees were important. In Isaiah 11:1, it talks about then a shoot. We're talking about a remnant. It says, then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit. In commentaries, some people say that that tree that they're talking about is an olive tree. Not just any tree. When I think of cutting a tree down and a stem grows out of it, in my mind, there's dozens of trees that it could be, right? But it's not a nondescript tree. This is a olive tree. Special, deep roots, long living, symbolizes peace and continuous growth and strength. And so his branch is going to grow and bear fruit. And it's not just going to grow, bear fruit for, 10 seasons or 15 seasons or 20 seasons, and then have to get cut down and a new one planted because it dries up and doesn't produce any more fruit. I mean, between where I live in Clarendon and Holly, on Route 237, it's nice and hilly, and you drive between it, and there's just old apple trees, because it used to be all orchards. And people have purchased the houses, and the apple trees are there, and sometimes you see apples on them, but my brother-in-law has these at his house, and the apples look atrocious. They look terrible. There's nothing that you would want to eat, because they're old trees and they don't produce well anymore. But olive trees are different. They just go and they keep going. In Psalm 52:8, it says, but I am like an olive tree, flourishing in the house of God. I trust in God's unfailing love forever and ever. Like an olive tree. I'm not like a silver maple in my front yard that got a little bit of ice on it and fell apart, right? An olive tree, it goes and it lasts. In Deuteronomy 28:40, it says, and this is in the curses, but just forget the curses for a minute and listen to the first part of the verse. You shall have olive trees throughout your territory, because they were everywhere. Now, they cultivated olive trees, and they used wild olive trees often for wood to build things, and you could get olives off them as well, but they cultivated olive trees and they grew them for olives, for that purpose. So olives, as I said, were important, but she was able to get enough where she could go out and sell it, I'm thinking at a lower price than you would get from somebody else, since it was plentiful, but she was able to sell it and do something. But this is an example of a widow, a mother, who stepped out in faith in a moment where everything seemed helpless and destitute. And she knew what the future could hold. My son's gone, and me, possibly with nobody to take care of me. And what would that mean for her? It would mean nothing. She would have to throw herself onto the mercies of the society around her, which was not always taking care of people the way it should. And so she knew it could mean her end. So she went to Elisha and she trusted. She had faith that something would happen here if she went to him. And then when he told her what to do, she was obedient to follow through. And because of that, she is blessed with her sons. So she's blessed with fruitfulness from her children and from her family as time went on. And that's important because there are lots, as we said, this was not uncommon to have these situations. But many of them did not experience this. They just experienced their children taken away and being left on the mercies of everyone around them. And we know that because, of course, the prophets say that they didn't do it. So it was a situation. So now we're going to talk about a second mother. And we're going to continue with the topic of faith in talking about this other mother. Now, this mother lived centuries before the widow in 2 Kings. A long time before. Because when she was alive, there weren't any kings of Israel. She lived in Egypt at a time when Israel, or the people of God, or the Hebrews, I guess at this point, not Israel yet, but the Hebrews that are slaves, oppressed in this Egyptian culture and society, named Jochebed. And Jochebed, go ahead and turn over to Hebrews 11. We don't read a lot about Jochebed in the scripture, or in the Bible, but from what we do read, we can take some things about her, about how she thinks and how she acts, what she thinks of what's going on around her in society. And what she sees happening, not only to herself, but to her family. I don't know what they did as slaves in Egypt, but they saw a lot of things. And they were under the thumb, under the power of a very strong kingdom or empire. It says in verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. When I read he was a beautiful child, most of the time the first thing that pops in my mind is a really cute baby. But when they say he was a beautiful child, there's something beyond looks here, right? Because when I'm at work and people come in with babies, I always wave at the babies or say I go talk to them or something, because babies are awesome. And someone at work told me, like, you always say stuff to the babies. I'm like, well, I love the babies. It's only when they get to be 6 or 7 that, things change, right? But when they're toddlers and they're babies, they're so cute. And beautiful, you could say. But there's something really special that was placed, I believe, in their minds regarding Moses. And he was beautiful. And then it says they were not afraid of the king's edict. Then we continue reading. It says, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Because it says that he considered the reproach of Christ. Moses had no idea who Jesus was. He was alive how many thousands of years before? I don't know. A long time. But there was something in him, something speaking to him. God, the Spirit saying, I have more, I have more, I have more, I have more. And the idea of what Christ was, what Christ became, was in Moses. That's why some commentators, and there's books, I got a book at home, Moses as Christ, or something like that title. They link things in Moses' life to the things of Christ. He's a type or a picture of what Christ would become in many ways, not in every way, of course, but that's what we're getting here. That's what we're seeing here in Hebrews, is in Moses, in his vision, he sees something beyond what's going on. And he knows that there's more. And so he goes out and looks into how all this is going to happen. That's not the purpose of our story, what Moses does. But we'll talk about it briefly in a moment. The purpose of our story is Jochebed, the mother. So we read books, all of Exodus, about Moses, and some in Leviticus, in Deuteronomy, right? Until he goes up to a mountain somewhere, we don't know where, and dies because he can go into the promised land, and then Joshua takes over. I was reading a book once that said that it was talking about the significance of Moses in the Old Testament, and they said, oddly enough, after his life, he's mentioned less and less and less as the Old Testament goes on. I guess maybe that's common, right? I mean, he's mentioned sometimes. They acknowledge that he was there, and they give him what he's due. But he went out and he did all these things, and we read all the time about these things, and we read about his life and everything that he did for Israel and the Exodus and getting them out and being the one that went up and talked to God and all these great things. But his mother, it's a child story for Sunday school, right? He was born and she made, I remember when I was in Sunday school once, we made like little paper baskets. Thank you, Rose. I couldn't get the word out of my mouth. I wanted to say ark. It was Moses' ark, right? For him. He got set out in this, and you would see things about like that as a child, but once you become an adult, the mention of Jochebed becomes small. But really, it's big. So Moses, as an infant, now, I'm going to say he grew up in a house that was privileged. When he was an infant, we might not think of his life as privileged because Jochebed has the baby, Moses. Her and her husband, they put him in a basket and they put him out in the reeds along the Nile River, where there's all kinds of crocodiles. But they put him out there, and he lives. And when Moses' daughter is out bathing, she finds him, right? And she keeps him. But Moses at first is given back to Jochebed. They don't know that she's the mother, but they send Moses home with her. Out, Pharaoh says, take him away from here and raise him. So she takes him out from the palace, out from Pharaoh's, palace compound, somewhere else. And I don't know if that was originally in her home, maybe, or whatever they lived in. That's where Moses was weaned. I call it privilege because she was paid. They lived in a land of slaves. She probably lived in a camp, some type of camp, with a bunch of other Hebrews. But she got paid for what she was doing, paid for by the kingdom of Egypt. So in that moment, there's already some power brewing around Moses. He's being raised as an infant by his mother. When all the other mothers around, if they had a boy, didn't have their sons. So already something special is happening. In Egypt, we know, if you know anything about history at that time in the world, Egypt is up and down in the Bible, right? They're powerful, they're not powerful. And Israel goes to them for help because, again, they're kind of powerful. And then the nations that are against Israel are mocking them because they're going to Egypt, who is nothing, right? But Egypt is up and down. At this time, Egypt was the world power of much of the known world. So Moses, after he's weaned, it says 3 months, after a short time, he's taken and he goes back to the palace, right? And he's taught in this palace. So now his life truly becomes privileged. He's taught the ways of Egypt. He's taught the ways of power, of influence, of speech, how to carry yourself, being from now that family, because he claims, or he says, in Hebrews it says, he would not take the name of the Pharaoh's daughter. So even though that's the position that he was put in his mind, I don't want that. I don't want to be from you. At this point in his life, or as he's growing up, he didn't know who his mother was, because he knew he was Hebrew, and he's growing up in an Egyptian household. Eventually he figures it out. Moses was blessed, though, to be born of a mother who was not afraid to oppose what was going on. She placed her child in a basket, knowing that in this land there's a king, and the king said, this is what's going to happen. And I imagine if any women were running around trying to save their babies, there's probably a lot of executions going on, if that was happening. But she decided that it doesn't matter. It says that she had faith to do that. Faith in God, even though they were oppressed and enslaved. She knew that there was something about her child that she needed to do, and they did it. In Acts 7:20, it says, it was at this time that Moses was born, and he was lovely in the sight of God, and he was nurtured 3 months in his father's home. So he was lovely, not only to the parents, but to God. And you think, well, what parents wouldn't think their child's lovely and beautiful enough to put in a basket in the reeds? There's something that God was working to make sure that they did this, that they tried to save their child, because God had ideas for Moses. So the courage of Jochebed, her faith in God, stirred her spirit to act. The courage of Pharaoh's daughter. We don't think about that, right? Pharaoh's daughter went against Pharaoh. She saw this baby, and she saw how lovely and beautiful this baby was, and took it into the palace, a Hebrew baby, and told her dad, asked her dad. Either she was spoiled or she was a good speaker, because she got her dad to say, fine, but I don't want it in the house right now. So find a mother for it to take care of it and get it out of here, right? But he didn't have it killed. He didn't have Moses killed. So eventually Moses comes back, and we said was raised there. So the Pharaoh and Jochebed both were very courageous women. Enough, both courageous enough. One to challenge what was going on around her with children. The other one enough to challenge her king. He was her father, but he's also the king, the Pharaoh. He's the guy in charge. So life becomes more important to them for this particular child than the law going on around them. In Matthew 12:11, Jesus is asking, if you had a sheep and it's on the Sabbath day and your sheep falls into a pit or a ditch, who's not going to take it out? Because you want to save that life regardless of what the law says, because that life means something economically to you, right? It does. So there are times when the life becomes more important than what the law is. So once Moses grows up, he remembers, or he understands who he is. He's not an Egyptian. He takes that and he puts it away from himself. I am not an Egyptian. Not powerful, according to the standards of the world around me and the family I grew up in. I'm not privileged and rich more than those who are suffering under the power that raised me. according to Hebrews, he's basically saying, I would rather be like all my brothers and sisters who are slaves with nothing, rather than be part of what raised me. Now, if we actually read the story of Moses growing up, it's a little different than what Hebrews says, right? Because he does do some things. He kills an Egyptian to try to help his brothers and sisters that he decides he wants to be part of. But he doesn't exactly go out and work in the mud pits with them making bricks. He decides, well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to stop the persecution that I'm seeing. And his brothers and sisters look at him and say, who are you? Right? You're not over us. You're not one of us. Because they see a person who was raised in the house of Pharaoh, even though he's a Hebrew. So there's some words about Moses going around, at least part of the camp, wherever he was, and so we know he leaves. In Hebrews 11, we're already there, 24 to 29, it says, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called a son of the Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. Considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, he was looking to the reward of not enjoying the passing pleasures of sin, of riches, of power, of fame. He was looking for what Christ or what God had to offer instead. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who was unseen. He endured as seeing somebody, in this passage, Christ, or at least the idea of Christ. He was looking for something he hadn't seen. That's what faith is. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, so that he who destroyed the firstborn would not touch them. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea as though they were passing through dry land, and the Egyptians, when they attempted it, were drowned. So because of Jochebed, Moses was able to trust and have faith in God in order to do the things he needed to do to free the Hebrews that would become the nation of Israel after all their trials and tribulations through the wilderness and finally making it to where they were supposed to be. It was a long thing. He says he endured with them. I know he did not endure with them, as I said, making bricks. He was trying to get them out. He did go through persecutions, and then once he got them out and they left the land, then, of course, he went through everything that they went through. I don't see Moses through the land being carried on a throne between men. He walked with everybody else. He lived like everybody else did. So Jochebed had great influence on her son's life. And you say, well, how could that be? Because she gave him up when he was 3 months old. The influence came just in the fact that she saved him and put him in a basket against what was being said to do. Her faith began the freedom of the entire nation. If she had not done that, and Moses hadn't become what he was supposed to become, I can't say it wouldn't have been free, because I'm sure God would have worked it out somehow, right? But her actions were what started everything. And not only Moses, but she had another son, Aaron. And was Aaron influential in Israel or in the beginnings of Israel? Of course he was. Not perfect in any way, neither was Moses, but the two of them, when they were following God, when they were doing what they were supposed to do, had profound influence on the future of God's people. And we read a lot about Aaron as well. And eventually read at least a little bit of Jochebed in Exodus, because she had a daughter, Miriam, also. So we know she had at least 3 children, 2 boys that grew up in different circumstances. One grew up in the household of Pharaoh, the other with his family. And they were both able to work the way God wanted them to work for their people, to get where they were supposed to go. So 2 mothers, that's all we have time to look at. There's lots of mothers in the Bible. Some of them are not good mothers. Others are very good mothers. But women overall feature in the Bible, right? Even in societies that were dominated at the time by men. The impact of the mothers in the Bible, even though their mention might not be big, there is a story that came after them. And that story is big, especially when you look at Moses. So it's important that we don't understate or underappreciate the role of mothers in the Bible. Amen. We'll see you back in about a little under 15 minutes.